The surveying contract was the first real work I'd had in 4 months. Before that, it was piecemeal stuff. Flagging property corners for a realtor in Calhoun County who paid cash and never returned my calls when the checks were light. Before that, a 2-week stint helping a crew from the State-Chi Re-Monument, a stretch of right-of-way along US 78 in Alabama that got washed out during the March floods. Before that, nothing. Just my name on 6 different job boards and the slow, daily arithmetic of watching a savings account bleed out. So when the firm in Chattanooga called, a small outfit, Hargrove and Associates, the kind of place that runs 3 crews and 1 good total station between them, I didn't ask many questions. They needed a 2-man team to do boundary and topographic work on a parcel in the mountains of North Georgia, up past Elijah, almost to the Tennessee line. Old family land, estate settlement. The heirs wanted it subdivided, and the county wanted a fresh plat before they'd approve anything. Standard work, 4 to 6 days in the field, maybe more depending on terrain and what the existing monumentation looked like. Per diem plus mileage. I said yes before the guy finished his second sentence. My partner on the job was a man named Dale Colvin, who I'd never met but who Hargrove described as experienced in the woods. That turned out to be an understatement in the way that calling the ocean wet is an understatement. Dale was 58 years old, born in Gilmer County, which was the same county we'd be working in. He'd been surveying since 1989. He had a face like a catcher's mitt and hands that looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts. Thick fingers, scarred knuckles, one thumbnail permanently black from something he never explained. He drove a 2004 Tacoma with 340,000 miles on it and a toolbox in the bed that was worth more than the truck. He didn't talk much. When he did, it mattered. We met at a gas station in Elijah on a Monday morning in October. The mountains were just starting to turn. Not peak color yet. That was still a couple weeks away. But the first streaks of orange were showing on the upper ridges where the sourwoods and hickories catch it first. The sky was overcast, flat gray, the kind of cloud cover that settles into the valleys up there and doesn't leave for days. It was 46 degrees at 7 in the morning, and the air smelled like wood smoke and wet leaves. Dale spread the deed descriptions out on the hood of his truck while I poured coffee from a thermos I'd filled at the motel in town. The parcel was 814 acres. That's big for North Georgia hill country. Most of the family tracts up there run 100, 200 acres. Old farmsteads that got carved up across generations. 800 acres meant somebody had either been buying or had never sold, and Dale confirmed it was the latter, the Elders family. They'd held that land since the 1840s. Cherokee removal land, he said, though he didn't editorialize on it. The family had simply been there a long time, and now the last of them, an old woman named Pauline Elders, who died in a nursing home in Dalton back in June, had left it to a collection of nieces and nephews scattered across 3 states who wanted it turned into money. The deed descriptions were a mess. They referenced trees that had been dead for a century, beginning at a white oak on the ridge, thence south 40 chains to a stake and stones near the branch. That kind of thing. The county had a tax map, but the tax map was based on the old descriptions, which meant it was essentially a guess drawn in thick lines. Our job was to find whatever old iron and stone monuments still existed, reconcile them with the deed calls, and produce a boundary survey accurate to modern standards. Then a second crew would come in and do the subdivision layout. We drove north out of Elijah on a state road that followed the Cartacay River for a while, before turning east up a series of switchbacks. The pavement ended about 12 miles in. After that, it was gravel, Forest Service road, Dale said, though the sign at the junction was so faded I couldn't read it. The gravel road climbed for another 3 miles. Then we turned off onto a track that was barely wider than the Tacoma. Dale drove it like he'd been here before. I asked him if he had. Once, he said, 15 years ago, timber company wanted a cruise estimate. We walked the western boundary. He paused. Didn't finish. I waited for him to say why, but he just shifted into 4 low and kept driving. The tract began at a gap in a fence line marked by 2 locust posts with no wire between them. Beyond that, the road became 2 ruts with a grass strip in the middle and rhododendron pressing in from both sides. We drove maybe a half mile in before the canopy closed overhead completely. White oaks, tulip poplars, hemlocks on the north-facing slopes, and the light dropped to something that felt more like late afternoon than mid-morning. Dale parked at a wide spot near a creek crossing. We loaded up the equipment, his total station on a tripod, my rod and prism, a GPS unit that would struggle under this canopy, pin flags, a machete, the deed descriptions in a waterproof case, and 2 copies of the tax map marked up with Dale's handwritten notes from the office. We also carried water, food, a first aid kit, and bear spray, because this was the southern edge of the range, where black bears were thick enough that you'd see sign every day, even if you never saw the animal. The first day was orientation. We weren't shooting yet. We were walking the perimeter as best we could, looking for old monuments, getting a feel for the terrain, identifying access problems. Dale worked from the deed calls and a compass. I followed with the GPS, collecting waypoints where I could get a satellite fix, which in practice meant small clearings and ridgetops. Under the hardwood canopy, it was fine. Under the hemlocks and rhododendron, the GPS was essentially a paperweight. The terrain was steep, not vertical, but relentless. The kind of grade where you're never walking on flat ground, where every step is either uphill or across a slope, where your ankles are working all day long, and by 4 in the afternoon, your knees feel 20 years older than the rest of you. The undergrowth varied. On the ridges it was open, leaf litter and scattered mountain laurel. In the draws it was dense. Rhododendron thickets so tight you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you, with trunks twisted into shapes that made you duck and turn and sometimes just push through on hands and knees. We found our first monument around noon. A sandstone marker about 18 inches tall, roughly dressed, with a chiseled X on top. It was on the northwest corner of the tract, right where the deed said it should be, and Dale smiled when he saw it, which was the first time I'd seen him do that. "Old work," he said, meaning it had been placed by a surveyor a long time ago, probably in the late 1800s. "If the rest of them are this good, we'll be out of here by Thursday." They were not that good. By the end of the first day, we'd walked roughly 3 miles of the boundary and found exactly 2 monuments. The sandstone marker and a length of rebar driven into the ground, near a creek confluence that Dale dated to the 1970s based on the style of the cap on top. The rest of the corners were either missing, buried, or had never been set at all. Several of the deed calls referenced features that no longer existed. A cleared field that was now 60-year-old forest, a road that had reverted to a creek bed, a marked poplar that could have been any of 1,000 trees or none of them. This was going to be a full week minimum. We drove back to town that evening. I was staying at a motel on the main road through Elijah, the kind of place with exterior doors and a parking lot that smelled like diesel from trucks that stopped at the gas station next door. Dale lived 40 minutes south toward Jasper, but he said he'd make the drive rather than pay for a room. I ate dinner alone at a Mexican restaurant and was asleep by 8:30. The second day we started on the eastern boundary, which climbed from the creek drainage up to a ridge that formed the high point of the property. The deed called it the divide between the waters of Cart Cay and Mountain Town, which was a geographic reference that still held. We could work from the ridgeline down. The underbrush was thinner up high, and I could get GPS fixes on the spine of the ridge, which helped. It was around 2 in the afternoon on that second day when I found the first one. We'd split up, not far, maybe 200 yards apart, working parallel along a section of the eastern boundary. Dale was downslope, looking for a monument near a spring the deed referenced. I was on the ridge, flagging a line of old blazes on the trees that someone had cut decades ago. Bark scars healed over, but still visible if you knew what to look for. I was focused on the trees, moving slowly, checking each trunk. The ground dropped away to my left into a narrow draw, not a major drainage, just a fold in the mountain where water collected during rains. The rhododendron was thick down in it, but right at the lip of the draw, in a small flat spot no bigger than a parking space, there was a headstone. I stopped walking. It was not what I expected to find, but it wasn't shocking either. Family cemeteries are common on old tracts in the southern mountains. People buried their dead on their own land for generations. You find them on hilltops, in clearings, sometimes right next to a house foundation. They're supposed to be noted on surveys, and they carry legal protections in Georgia. Even if you buy the land, you can't disturb the graves. Finding one on the elder's property was actually predictable. 800 acres, 180 years of family occupation. There were probably several, but this wasn't a cemetery. It was a single headstone, alone in a spot where no one would have any practical reason to put a grave. No clearing, no path, no other markers, no fence, just one stone about 2 feet tall, rough cut but squared, set upright in the ground with the dressed face pointing southeast. I walked down to it. The face was covered in lichen, pale green, almost white, the kind that grows on stone in deep shade over very long periods. I pulled my sleeve over my hand and rubbed some of it away. There was a name cut into the stone. The carving was old, not machine cut, hand chiseled, but the letters were clear and deep, and whoever had done the work had been skilled. The name was my name. Not just my last name, my full name, first, middle, and last, exactly as it appears on my driver's license, my birth certificate, my social security card. I stood there for what felt like a long time. I can reconstruct the sequence of what I thought, because I've gone over it so many times since then, that the memory has been polished into something almost artificial, like a stone in a riverbed. First coincidence, common name. My last name is not unusual. My first name is ordinary. The middle name gave me trouble, because it's my mother's maiden name, and it's not common. It's not a name you'd encounter by chance, but I told myself it was possible, unlikely, but possible. Below the name there was a date, one date, not a span, no birth and death, just a single date carved in the same hand as the name. It was a date that hadn't happened yet. It was 17 days away. I don't remember making a sound. I don't remember stepping back. What I remember is the quality of the light in that spot, grey-green, underwater light, filtered through the canopy until it had no direction, no source, just a general dimness that made the stone look like it had always been there, and the forest had been built around it. And I remember the sound, which was nothing. not silence. I could hear the creak below, a woodpecker somewhere up the ridge, wind moving through the high branches. But in the drawer itself, in the flat spot where the stone stood, the air was still in a way that felt deliberate, as though the space had been set aside from the rest of the forest for a specific purpose, and that purpose required quiet. I called Dale on the radio. He came up the slope in about 10 minutes, breathing hard, his face red. He saw the headstone before I said anything about it. He stopped about 15 feet away and looked at it the way you'd look at a snake on a trail. Not panicked, but very still, very attentive. "That yours?" he asked, and for a second I thought he could read the name from where he stood, which was impossible at that distance. Then I realized he meant something else. He was asking if I'd found it. "Yeah," I said. "Come look at this." He walked closer. He read the name. He looked at me. His expression didn't change much. Dale's face didn't have a wide range, but something shifted behind his eyes. "A calculation. That's you," he said. "It's my name, full name." "Yeah." He looked at the date. He didn't say anything about it for a while. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a pencil, then seemed to think better of it and put it back. "The date," he said. "I see it. That's 17 days from now. I know." He looked around the drawer, up the slopes on both sides, into the rhododendron, up at the canopy. He turned a full 360 degrees, slowly, like he was reading the terrain for something I couldn't see. "There's no path in here," he said. "No path, no cleared ground. Nobody's been maintaining this." He was right. There was no evidence of visitation, no flowers, no flags, no cleared brush. The stone was set firmly in the ground, not tilted, not sinking, which meant it had been set well, with a proper foundation. But the forest had grown up around it completely. A sapling was growing within a foot of the base, and its roots had not displaced the stone, which meant either the stone predated the tree or the tree had grown to accommodate it. "How old do you think the carving is?" I asked. Dale crouched down and looked at the chisel marks. He ran a finger along one of the letters. "Handwork, good handwork. The weathering on the cuts, I'd say 50 years minimum. Could be more. Hard to say with this stone. It's local. Probably cut from the same sandstone as the monument we found yesterday. 50 years. The stone had been here for at least 50 years, bearing my name and a date that was now 17 days in the future. I am 34 years old. 50 years ago, I did not exist." Dale stood up. He pulled out his phone and took a photograph of the stone, then another from a wider angle that showed its position in the drawer. He typed something into its app. Then he put the phone away and looked at me with an expression I would later come to understand as the look of a man deciding how much of what he knew to share with someone he'd known for less than 48 hours. "We should mark it on the plat," he said. "Cemetery notation. Single interment apparent. I'll get the coordinates when we come back with the total station." Dale. "Yeah, that's my name, my exact name. And a date that's 2.5 weeks from now. I know it. How is that possible?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the stone again. Then up the ridge in the direction we'd been working. Then he said something that didn't answer my question, but that I've thought about every day since. "This isn't the only one up here." He said it quietly, almost to himself, and then he started walking back up toward the ridge. I followed, because what else was I going to do? We were 3 miles into the woods on a mountain in North Georgia, and Dale Colvin was the only person within earshot and the only person who seemed to know what this land contained. We didn't talk about it for the rest of the afternoon. We worked. We flagged another half mile of boundary, found another old blaze line, shot some preliminary points with the total station where the canopy opened enough. Dale was quieter than he'd been, which was notable because he hadn't been talkative to begin with. But there was a different quality to his silence now. Not withdrawn, but watchful. He kept scanning the terrain downslope as we moved along the ridge, and twice he stopped and looked into drawers similar to one where I'd found the stone, studying them for a long moment before moving on. At the truck that evening, loading equipment, I tried again. You said there were others. He was coiling the cord for the total station charger with the precision of someone who had done it 10,000 times. I said this wasn't the only one. What does that mean? Other headstones. I found one 15 years ago when I was out here for the timber cruise. With a name on it? With a name on it. He put the coiled cord in the toolbox and closed the lid. A date too. Same thing, one date future. Not my name though. The name of a man I was working with. Fellow named Gareth Powell. The air in the gap where we'd parked felt colder than it should have. The sun was already behind the western ridge, and the hollow was filling with that blue-grey mountain darkness that comes up from below. What happened to him? Dale opened the driver's side door of the Tacoma. He died, he said, on the date on the stone. He got in the truck. I stood there for a moment, then got in on the passenger side, because my truck was parked back at the gas station in Elijah, and Dale was my ride. We drove down the mountain in silence. The headlights caught the rhododendron, pressing in from both sides of the track, and the leaves were wet. It had rained up high while we were working, though we hadn't felt it under the canopy, and they threw the light back in a way that made the tunnel of vegetation look like it was constructed from something reflective and deliberate. At the gas station, Dale put the truck in park but didn't turn it off. I had my hand on the door handle. The date on Gareth's stone, I said. When you found it, how far out was it? 12 days, and he died on that day. Vehicle accident, Highway 515, south of Blue Ridge. 18-wheeler crossed the center line. Did you tell him about the stone? Dale looked at me. The dashboard lights made his face look older than it was, hollowed out. The lines deepened into shadows. I told him. He didn't take it the way you're taking it. He got angry. Said I was messing with him. We finished the job, what we finished of it, and he drove home. 12 days later, his wife called the office and said he was gone, and you came back here. You took this job knowing what was up here. I took this job because Hargrove asked me, and I need the work same as you. He put both hands on the steering wheel and stared through the windshield at the gas station's fluorescent canopy, where moths were circling in the white light. And because I've spent 15 years not knowing what I walked away from, and that's been worse than whatever knowing would be. I got out of the truck. I stood in the parking lot and watched his taillights descend toward the highway and disappear around the curve. Then I went to my motel room and sat on the bed without turning on the lights and tried to construct a rational framework for what had happened. Here is what I had: a headstone with my name and a future date, found on a remote mountain in a tract of land I had never visited before, carved by hand at least 50 years ago. A corroborating account from a man with no apparent motive to lie, describing an identical phenomenon with a verifiable outcome. Someone had died on the predicted date, and a piece of land that had been in one family for nearly 2 centuries, a family that was now entirely gone. Here is what I did not have: any explanation. I called my mother, not about the stone. I wasn't going to tell her about the stone, but because I wanted to hear her voice and because the question had occurred to me and I needed to answer it before it grew any larger. I asked her about my middle name. She said what she'd always said. It was her maiden name. She'd given it to me because she was the last of her line and wanted it to continue somewhere. I asked her if her family had any connection to North Georgia. She said no. Her people were from Tidewater, Virginia, had been for as long as anyone remembered. No Georgia, no mountains. I asked if she'd ever heard of the Elders family. She hadn't. I didn't sleep that night. Not from fear exactly, but from the particular kind of wakefulness that comes when your mind has encountered something it cannot file. Something that doesn't fit into the existing architecture of how you understand the world. I lay on the motel bed and listened to the trucks on the highway and the ice machine cycling outside my door, and I thought about Gareth Powell driving south on 5 and 15 and the 18-wheeler crossing the center line, and whether there was a headstone still standing in a drawer on that mountain with his name on it and a date that had long since passed. In the morning, I almost didn't go. I sat in my truck in the gas station parking lot with the engine running and considered the simple mathematics of it. I could leave, drive south to Atlanta, get on I-20, be home in Alabama by evening, call Hargrove, say the terrain was worse than expected, say I'd gotten sick, say anything, forfeit the pay, stay alive. But that's not what happened. What happened is that Dale pulled up in his Tacoma at 7:15, same as the day before, and got out carrying 2 cups of gas station coffee and handed me one and said, "Eastern boundary, south section. I want to find that spring before noon." And I went. I went because I needed the money. That's the true answer, the one that sounds stupid and small against the rest of it, but it's the one that operated. I had $1,100 in my bank account and rent due in 9 days and a truck payment due in 16, and the per diem from this job was the only income I had or was likely to have before the end of the month. I went because I could not afford to be frightened. That's the kind of math that governs most of the decisions made by most of the people I know, and if you've never had to make it, I don't know how to explain it to you. We drove up the mountain. The cloud cover was lower than the day before. We drove into it about 2/3 of the way up, and the world outside the windshield turned to grey cotton. By the time we parked at the creek crossing, visibility was maybe 100 feet. The trees disappeared into the fog above and below, and the forest felt smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because you couldn't see the distances, larger because you could feel them, the mountain continuing in every direction beyond what your eyes could verify. Dale didn't mention the headstone. Neither did I. We worked. South section of the eastern boundary, following the ridge as it curved down toward a saddle connecting to the next mountain. The deed called for a chestnut stump on the divide, which was a reference to the American chestnut, which had been functionally extinct in these mountains since the 1950s. The stump, if it had ever existed, was gone. We found a depression in the ground where a large tree had rotted out, and Dale flagged it as a possible location, and we shot it with the total station and moved on. At 11:40, I found the second headstone. This one was in a different kind of spot. Not a drawer, but a flat bench on the side of the ridge, a natural terrace about 30 feet wide, covered in thick leaf litter and ringed by hemlocks. The stone was smaller than the first one, maybe 18 inches tall, and it was leaning slightly to the east, as though the ground beneath it had settled unevenly over the years. Same sandstone, same hand-cut lettering. The name on it was Dale Raymond Colvin. The date was the same date that was on mine. I stood there looking at it and feeling something rearrange itself inside my chest. Not fear, not yet, but the precursor to fear, the moment when the pattern you've been trying to dismiss reveals itself as a pattern and not a coincidence. One stone with my name could be explained, barely, ridiculously, but it could be attempted. Two stones in separate locations bearing the names of the two people currently working on this land with the same date, a date 17 days away when I found the first one, now 16, that could not be explained. That was something else. I radioed Dale. He came. He read his name. He read the date. He stood for a long time with his hands in his vest pockets and his jaw working slightly, the way it did when he was thinking hard. Then he got down on one knee and examined the base of the stone where it entered the ground. Same setter, he said. Same chisel, same hand, same stone. Whoever did mine did yours. At least 50 years ago. At least. Dale, you would have been a child 50 years ago. I would have been 8. He stood up and brushed the leaf litter off his knee. I've been thinking about that since yesterday. I've been thinking about it for 15 years, if I'm honest. He told me then, standing on that foggy bench with his own headstone at his feet, what he hadn't finished telling me the night before. When he'd found Gareth Powell's stone 15 years ago, he'd also found a second one nearby. That stone bore a name he didn't recognize, not his, not anyone he knew, a woman's name. He'd written it down, but lost the notebook in a move years later and couldn't remember it now. The date on the woman's stone had already passed by the time he found it. It was a date from 1987. He'd tried to find out if anyone by that name had died on that date. He'd searched newspapers, obituaries, online databases. Nothing. Either the woman hadn't died or she'd died. Somewhere he couldn't find the record. Or the name was wrong. Or the stone meant something other than what it appeared to mean. So Gareth's came true, and the other one didn't, I said. Or the other one came true in a way I can't verify. That's not comforting. It's not meant to be. The fog had thickened while we were talking. I could no longer see the hemlocks at the edge of the bench. They were grey shapes, suggestions of trees, vertical smears in the white. The total station on its tripod looked like a figure standing watch. The silence up here was different from the silence in the drawer where I'd found my stone. That silence had felt enclosed, private. This silence felt open and patient, like something very large was simply waiting to see what we would do. How many do you think there are? I asked. Dale looked downslope into the fog. On 800 acres, with terrain like this, he shook his head slowly. Could be dozens, could be hundreds. Every drawer, every bench, every flat spot big enough to set a stone. And they all have names? I don't know. I've seen 3, and 3 had names. Yours, mine, Gareth's. The woman from 87. That's 4. He looked at me. 4, he agreed. He picked up his rod and prism. We need to keep working. We kept working, but the character of the work had changed. Every time we descended into a drawer, every time we crossed a flat spot, every time the undergrowth opened into a small clear clearing, I was looking, not for monuments or blazed trees or old iron, for headstones. I was scanning the ground the way you scan water for submerged rocks when you're wading a river, looking for the shape that doesn't belong, the vertical line in a world of horizontals. I found the third one at 3:15, then the fourth at 3:40, then 2 more before we lost the light at 5. 6 headstones in one afternoon, 6 names. Some I recognized as common, James, Robert, Mary, and some were unusual enough that they felt specific rather than generic. All had single dates, all future, or at least they had been future when carved. Several of the dates had passed, one as early as 1961, one as recently as 2019. Some were still ahead. The furthest out was a date in 2031. All of the stones were the same sandstone, all hand-carved. All showed the same degree of weathering, the same lichen growth, the same skilled chisel work. Dale examined each one and said the same thing every time. Same hand, same period, same stone. They had all been made and placed at approximately the same time, which he estimated at 60 to 80 years ago. The 1940s or 1950s, someone had carved dozens, maybe hundreds, of headstones bearing specific names and specific future dates, carried them into the mountains, and placed them in individual locations across 814 acres of remote forest. They had done this in the mid-20th century. They had included dates spanning at least 70 years into the future. They had included my name, the name of a man who would not be born for another 3 decades. At the truck that evening, Dale spread out the tax map and marked each stone's approximate location with a small X, 6 X's. They didn't form a pattern I could see. No line, no circle, no grid. They were scattered across the eastern half of the property, in drawers and on benches, and in one case on a narrow ridgetop, each one alone, each one in a spot that required deliberate effort to reach. The Elders family, I said. What do you know about them? Dale folded the map carefully along its creases. I know they kept to themselves. I know Pauline Elders lived alone on this land until she was 91 and went to the nursing home. I know the county tax office has records of the family paying taxes on this parcel continuously since 1847. I know that when the timber company tried to negotiate a cutting contract 15 years ago, Pauline refused, and the company was told by a lawyer in Dalton that the family had refused every offer on the timber or the land for as long as anyone had records. Did you meet her? No, she was already in the home when I came out. I dealt with the timber company. They had a temporary access easement for the crews, just to evaluate the timber, not to cut. When Gareth Stone turned up, I reported it to the company as a cultural find. They told me to flag it and move on. I flagged it and decided not to move on. Told my boss the terrain was too rough for the timeline and pulled off the job. And now you're back. And now I'm back. He put the map in his case, and so are you. And both our names are on stones up there with the same date on them, and that date is 16 days from now, and I don't know what to do with that any more than you do. We drove down the mountain. At the gas station, Dale stayed in the truck this time, engine running. I'll see you in the morning, he said, but I want to say something first. I waited. If you leave tonight, I understand. I won't think less of you, and I'll tell Hargrove whatever you want me to tell him. If you stay, I need to know you're going to stay for the whole job, because I can't do this alone, and I can't do it with someone who might bolt on day 4. What are you going to do? I'm going to finish the survey. I'm going to find every stone on that mountain, and I'm going to be alive on the 18th of this month, and the 19th, and the 20th, and every day after that, because a rock in the ground doesn't get to tell me when I stop. He said it with the particular conviction of a man who has been rehearsing the sentence for 15 years, and I believed that he believed it, and I did not know whether I believed it too. I went to my motel room. I sat on the bed. I looked at my phone and saw that I had 1 bar of service and a text from my ex-wife asking whether I could contribute to our daughter's dental bill, which was $340 and overdue. At my bank account, $1,047. The survey job, if completed, would pay $4,200. If I left, I'd have the $1,147 and no work lined up, and a dental bill and rent, and a truck payment, and the slow, grinding arithmetic that had governed my life for the past 2 years. I texted my ex-wife, "I'll have it by the end of the month," and I went back to the mountain in the morning. Wednesday, day 3. The fog had lifted overnight, and the sky was that particular high blue that the southern mountains get in mid-October, when a cold front has pushed through and scoured the atmosphere clean. You could see 50 miles from the ridgetops. The color was coming in faster now, the maples catching fire, the hickories going gold, the oaks holding on to their green, but starting to bronze at the edges. It was beautiful. I want to be clear about that. Whatever else was on that mountain, it was one of the most beautiful places I have ever been. And on that Wednesday morning, walking the south boundary with Dale through open hardwoods in slanting golden light, I felt something that I am not sure I can name accurately, not peace, exactly. Something closer to the feeling of being in the right place at the right time, which is a feeling I have almost never had. Dale felt it too, or something like it. He was more talkative that morning than he'd been on any previous day. He told me about growing up in Gilmer County, about his father who had been a logger, about learning to survey from a man named Hoke Garrett, who had operated out of a one-room office in Ellijay, with a transit from the 1940s and a set of deed books that went back to the Cherokee treaties. He told me about his first marriage, which had ended, and his second marriage, which had also ended, and his daughter who lived in Savannah and worked for an insurance company and didn't return his calls reliably, which he said he understood because he hadn't returned his own father's calls reliably either. And that seemed to be how it went. I told him about my daughter, about the divorce, about the apartment in Birmingham that I couldn't really afford, but that was close enough to the school that I could pick her up on my weekday afternoons, which were Tuesday and Thursday, which were the best days of my week and had been for 2 years. I told him about the surveying work drying up, about the economy, about the particular humiliation of being good at something that not enough people need done. We talked like men talk when they're working together in the woods, not facing each other, not making eye contact, but side by side, moving through terrain, letting the conversation happen in the gaps between physical effort. It was the most human I'd felt in months. We found 4 more headstones that day. The names meant nothing to me. Dale recognized one, a surname, Pinkston, that he said was an old Gilmer County family, most of them gone, now moved away or died out. The date on the Pinkston stone was 2003. We had no way of knowing if anyone named Pinkston had died that year, but Dale wrote it down. We also found something else. It was late afternoon, and we were working the south boundary, where it crossed a major creek, the biggest drainage on the property, a permanent stream that Dale called Elder's Branch, though he said that name probably wouldn't appear on any map. The boundary followed the creek for about a quarter mile before climbing out of the drainage to the south, and we were walking the creek looking for a monument described in the deed as an iron pin set in a rock on the north bank. The creek bottom was wide here, maybe 40 feet across, with the stream itself taking up about 10 feet of that, and the rest being cobble and sand, and the kind of flat alluvial ground that floods deposit over centuries. The canopy was open above the creek. You could see the sky, which was dimming toward evening, and the light was better than it had been anywhere else on the property. Dale was ahead of me, working the north bank, when he stopped. He didn't call out, he just stopped moving. I came up behind him and saw what he was looking at. There was a structure on the bank, not a building, nothing that ambitious. A low wall, maybe 3 feet high and 20 feet long, built from the same sandstone that the headstones were made of. It was dry stacked, no mortar, fitted together with the kind of precision that takes real skill, each stone shaped to sit against its neighbor, without gaps. The wall ran parallel to the creek, and behind it, built into the bank itself, was a shelf, a flat surface of fitted stone, like a workbench or an altar, about waist height and 6 feet long. On the shelf were tools, a chisel, a mallet, a straight edge, a set of letter punches, the kind used to stamp characters into stone. They were iron, all of them, and they were rusted but intact, sitting on the stone shelf, as though someone had set them down an hour ago and stepped away. Dale picked up the chisel. He turned it over in his hands. The edge was still sharp enough to see the bevel. He set it back down exactly where it had been. "This is where they were made," he said. He was right. You could see it now. The stone dust worked into the cracks of the shelf, the faint marks on the surface where a chisel had slipped or been tested. This was a workshop. Someone had sat here on the bank of Elder's Branch and carved headstones, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They had carved names and dates into sandstone with hand tools, and then they had carried those stones, each one weighing 40, 50, 60 pounds, up the mountain and set them in individual locations across 814 acres of forest. The scale of it was staggering. Even if there were only the 10 stones we'd found so far, that represented hundreds of hours of labor. The carving alone, then the transport, then the setting. And Dale thought there could be far more. Hundreds, he'd said. On a mountain this big, with this much terrain, you could hide 1,000 headstones and a person could walk the land for years without finding them all. "Who?" I said. It was the only word I could manage. Dale was examining the letter punches, lifting them one at a time, and setting them back down. The elders had to be. No one else had access. No one else had reason. He paused and no one else had the time. This wasn't done in a week or a month. This was years of work, decades maybe. But the names, how did they know the names? My name, your name, people who hadn't been born yet. Dale set the last punch down and stood looking at the shelf with an expression I couldn't read. It wasn't fear, it wasn't confusion. It was something closer to recognition. The face of a man who has suspected something for a very long time and has finally found the evidence that confirms the suspicion. And the confirmation is worse than the uncertainty, but at least it's solid. At least it's real. At least it's something you can put your hands on. "I don't know," he said, "but I intend to find out." We marked the workshop on the map. Dale photographed everything. The wall, the shelf, the tools, the stone dust in the cracks. We measured the wall with a tape. We noted the position relative to the creek and the boundary line. We did these things because we were surveyors, and documentation was what we knew how to do when we didn't know what else to do. Then we walked back to the truck in near darkness, following the creek downstream by the sound of the water, because the canopy was too thick for the last light to reach the ground. Dale used a headlamp. I used my phone's flashlight. Neither of us spoke. At the gas station, he turned off the truck this time and sat in the dark cab for a moment before speaking. "Tomorrow," he said, "I want to go to the courthouse, county records. Deed transfers, estate filings, anything on the Elders family. Then the Historical Society, if they have one. The nursing home in Dalton where Pauline died. Someone knew this family. Someone can tell us something. I thought we were finishing the survey. We will, but I need a day off that mountain." He looked at me. "Don't you?" I did. God, I did. I needed a day in town, in fluorescent light, surrounded by filing cabinets and bored county clerks and the ordinary machinery of public records. I needed to be in a building with cell service and a vending machine, and the sound of someone else's phone ringing down the hall. I needed to not be in the woods. Yeah, I said. Courthouse. Tomorrow. I went to my motel room and locked the door and turned on every light. I stood in the shower until the hot water ran out. I ate a gas station sandwich sitting on the bed and watched the local news on a television that got 4 channels. The weather forecast called for rain starting Friday and continuing through the weekend. I thought about the stones on the mountain getting rained on, the water running over the carved letters of my name, pooling in the serifs, filling the date that was now 15 days away. I called my daughter. She was 9. She answered on the second ring. Because she always answered on the second ring when it was me, and the sound of her voice hit me in a place I hadn't known was exposed. Hey baby. Hi daddy. Are you still in the mountains? Still in the mountains. How was school? She told me about school. She told me about her friend Olivia and a project about the solar system and how she'd been assigned Neptune, which she said was the best planet because it was blue and far away. She told me her mother had made spaghetti and that the sauce was different. And she didn't like it but didn't say so because she didn't want to hurt her mother's feelings. She asked me when I was coming home. End of the week, I said. Maybe a little longer. The job's bigger than they thought. Are there bears? Probably. I haven't seen one yet. If you see one, don't run. You're supposed to make yourself look big. I know, baby. I won't run. Promise? Promise. After she hung up, I sat on the bed and did the math again. 15 days. If the date on the stone was real, if it meant what it appeared to mean, then I had 15 days. My daughter would be 9 years old and fatherless. My ex-wife would be a single mother with a $340 dental bill and no one to split it with. The apartment in Birmingham would be cleaned out by someone, probably my brother. And the lease would be broken, and the surveying equipment I'd been buying piece by piece over 10 years would be sold at a fraction of its value because no one in my family knew what any of it was worth. This is what I thought about, not the metaphysics, not the impossibility, the logistics of my own absence, the arithmetic. Then I thought about Gareth Powell, who had also been told and had also had a date, and had died on a highway 12 days later, an 18-wheeler crossing the center line. Random, mechanical, the kind of death that doesn't need a headstone on a mountain to cause it. It just happens every day. To someone, the stones didn't cause anything. Maybe they only knew. And if they only knew, then the question wasn't how to stop it. The question was whether knowing changed anything at all, or whether the 15 days remaining were the same 15 days I would have had regardless, just colored differently now. Not longer, not shorter, but heavier, denser, saturated with the awareness that each one might matter in a way I had never had to consider before. I didn't sleep again, but the wakefulness was different this time, less frantic, more like the alertness of an animal that has scented something, but cannot see it yet and is simply waiting, ears forward, breathing steady, to see what comes out of the dark. Thursday morning, Dale picked me up at 7 and we drove to the Gilmer County Courthouse in Elijah. It was a small building, newer than you'd expect. The old courthouse had burned in the 1980s and been replaced with a brick structure that looked like a large dentist's office. The clerk of court's office was on the first floor, staffed by 2 women who looked like they'd been there since the building was constructed and would be there when it was demolished. Dale knew one of them, Martha. She was about his age, with reading glasses on a chain and a cardigan despite the building being overheated. She smiled when she saw Dale, and then her smile got complicated, the way smiles do when they carry history. Dale Colvin, I heard you were back up on the Elder's place. Word travels. In this county, word doesn't travel. It just lives here. She looked at me. You're the other surveyor. I introduced myself. She repeated my name back to me with a slight frown, as though she were filing it somewhere. And then she asked what we needed. Dale asked for everything on the Elder's property, deed chain, estate filings, any recorded plats, tax records. Martha disappeared into a back room and came out 15 minutes later with a stack of oversized books and a manila folder. The deed chain was as long as you'd expect for a property held since the 1840s. The original grant was a state land lottery parcel issued in 1833 to a man named Horace Elders. The land had passed from Horace to his son Josiah, from Josiah to his son Samuel, from Samuel to his daughter, unusual for the time, named Ruth Elders, who held it from 1911 to 1963. From Ruth it passed to her nephew, a man named Clement Elders, who held it until his death in 1988, when it passed to his sister Pauline. Pauline held it until her death in June of this year. Ruth Elders, 1911 to 1963. 52 years of ownership, spanning exactly the period when Dale estimated the headstones had been carved. I asked Martha if she knew anything about Ruth Elders. She took off her reading glasses and let them hang on the chain. Ruth Elders, she said, was what my grandmother would have called a particular woman. She lived alone on that mountain from the time she was maybe 25 until she died. Never married, never left the property, as far as anyone knew. My grandmother said she came to town once a year, in the fall, bought supplies at the general store that used to be where the Ingalls is now, paid cash, didn't speak to anyone she didn't have to, and drove back up the mountain in a truck that she reportedly maintained herself. Did she have any kind of reputation? Anything unusual? Martha's expression shifted. Not unfriendly, but careful. This is Gilmer County. A woman living alone on a mountain for 50 years is unusual enough without adding anything to it. She paused. But yes, there were stories. My grandmother told some of them. Most of it was the kind of thing people say about anyone they don't understand. That she was a witch, that she talked to the dead, that kind of thing. Mountain talk. I wouldn't put stock in it. Anything specific? One thing. Martha looked at Dale, then at me, and seemed to make a decision. My grandmother said that Ruth Elders knew things, not in a fortune-telling way, not cards or crystals or any of that. She said Ruth knew things about people. She said Ruth told her once, in the store, that her husband, my grandfather, would die in March of a year that was still 5 years away. And he did pneumonia. March 1958. The clerk's office was quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere in the building, a phone was ringing and no one was answering it. My grandmother never went back to that store, Martha said. Not while Ruth was alive. We spent 2 more hours at the courthouse. The estate filing for Pauline Elders was straightforward. She died intestate, and the probate court had identified 11 heirs, none of whom lived in Georgia. The property had been appraised. The heirs had agreed to sell, and the survey was the last step before listing. Nothing in the legal record indicated anything unusual about the land itself. No recorded cemeteries, no cultural resource notations, no conservation easements, no prior surveys on file at all. The property had never been formally surveyed in its 180-year history. That was unusual. In Georgia, any transfer of land requires a legal description, and most legal descriptions are based on a survey. but the elders' property had been passed within the family continuously, and the family had apparently never felt the need to hire anyone to measure what they already knew. The deed descriptions with their chestnut stumps and marked poplars had been sufficient until now. From the courthouse we drove to the Gilm County Historical Society, which was a single room in the basement of the public library, staffed by a retired schoolteacher named Glenn, who was delighted to have visitors, and who produced from a filing cabinet a folder labeled Elders that contained exactly 3 items: a photocopy of a 1920s era photograph showing a farmstead on a mountain, a cabin, a barn, a woman standing in the yard who might have been Ruth, a 1-paragraph entry from a 1953 county history book that described the Elders as an old Cherokee removal family of private habits and substantial landholdings, and a handwritten note on lined paper, undated, that read, "Ruth Elders called at the office today." She wanted to know if the Historical Society maintained records of all persons born in Gilmer County. I told her we did not. She asked where such records might be found. I directed her to the county health department and the church registries. She thanked me and left. She was carrying a leather satchel that appeared to contain papers or notebooks. She did not say why she needed the birth records. Dale read the note twice and then photographed it. Glenn, the retired schoolteacher, watched us with the bright-eyed curiosity of a man who had been waiting years for someone to be interested in the contents of his filing cabinets. "Are you researching the Elders family?" he asked. "In a manner of speaking," Dale said. "We're surveying the property." "Ah, shame about Pauline. She was the last one. Came to see me once about 10 years ago. Wanted to donate some family papers. I was thrilled, of course. But when she came back the next week, she'd changed her mind. Said she'd decided to burn them instead. I begged her not to, but she was firm. She said there were things in her family's history that didn't belong in a filing cabinet." "Did she say what things?" Glenn shook his head. "She just said, some records shouldn't outlast the people they're about." I remember the phrasing because it struck me as poetic and sad. We left the Historical Society. It was early afternoon. Dale drove to a diner on the main road, and we sat in a booth and ordered coffee and didn't say anything for a while. The diner was half full, retirees, a couple of construction workers, a woman with a toddler, normal, ordinary, the kind of scene I'd sat in 1,000 times without noticing it, and now noticed intensely, the way you notice the taste of water when you've been told the well might be contaminated. "Ruth Elders," Dale said, "spent 50 years on that mountain. She sought out birth records. She carved headstones with names and dates. And her sister Pauline the family papers rather than let anyone see them. You think Ruth made the stones. Someone on that mountain made them. She's the one who was there. She's the one who wanted the names." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Birth records. She wanted to know who was being born, not who had died, who was being born. And then she carved their names into stones and put dates on them and carried them into the woods. How did she know the dates? Same way she knew Martha's grandfather would die in March of 58. She knew. That's not an explanation. "No," Dale agreed. "It's not. It's a description. An explanation would require understanding something I don't think we're going to understand by looking at courthouse records and talking to a man in a library basement. Then what do we do?" Dale looked out the window at the parking lot and the mountains beyond it, the ridgeline sharp against the blue October sky. "We go back up, we finish the survey, we find every stone we can, and we see if the land itself tells us anything the records won't. We didn't go back up that afternoon. We drove to Dalton instead, an hour south, to the nursing home where Pauline Elders had died. It was a facility called Mountain View, which had a view of a Walmart parking lot. And, beyond that, the distant suggestion of mountains that might have justified the name on a clearer day. The administrator was a woman named Daphne, who was professionally sympathetic and practically unhelpful. Pauline Elders had been a resident for 3 years. She had been quiet, lucid until the last few months, and had had no regular visitors. Her personal effects had been boxed and sent to the attorney handling the estate. There was nothing remarkable about her stay. Dale asked if Pauline had said anything in her lucid period about the property or the family history. Daphne said she'd check with the nursing staff and gave us her card. She never called. On the drive back to Elijah, Dale told me about Gareth Powell in more detail. Gareth had been 32 when they'd worked the timber cruise. A family man, wife, 2 young kids, a mortgage in Ringgold. When Dale showed him the headstone, Gareth had gotten angry, then quiet, then dismissive. He'd told Dale it was vandalism, someone's idea of a sick joke. He'd refused to discuss it further. They'd finished what they could of the cruise and left. 12 days later, Gareth was dead. "Did you go to the funeral?" I asked. I did. His wife didn't know me, but she shook my hand. The kids were 3 and 5. The 5-year-old kept asking people where his dad's truck was. We drove in silence for a while. "Did you ever think about going back and destroying the stone?" I said. "Gareth's stone. After he died, I thought about it. I didn't do it. Why not? Because I wasn't sure what destroying it would mean. If the stone predicted his death, it was already fulfilled. Breaking it wouldn't undo anything. And if the stone caused his death," he trailed off, "then breaking it might not stop what it started. Or it might release something, or anger something, or it might do nothing at all." I didn't know. I still don't know. And when you don't know what the rules are, the safest thing is to not change anything until you do. We reached Elijah at dusk. Dale dropped me at the motel. 14 days remained. The number had become a metronome in the back of my mind, ticking forward whether I attended to it or not. That night I did something I hadn't done since I was a kid. I prayed. Not to anything specific, not with any words I'd learned. I just sat on the edge of the motel bed and closed my eyes and asked whatever might be listening to let me see my daughter grow up. That's all I asked for. Not an explanation, not a rescue, just time. Friday, Dale arrived at 7:15 and we drove up the mountain into rain. Not heavy rain, a steady, fine drizzle that the mountains produce by pulling clouds through the gaps like cotton through a loom. The forest was different in the rain. The colors were more saturated, the reds deeper, the greens almost electric, and every surface was running with water. The creeks were up. Elder's Branch, when we crossed it, was a foot higher than it had been on Wednesday, and the stones of the workshop wall were dark with moisture. We worked the southern boundary, pushing west. The terrain was the worst we'd encountered. Steep, rocky, choked with rhododendron and mountain laurel, the ground slick with wet leaves over clay. We moved slowly. The total station was useless in the rain. The electronic distance measurement can't work through heavy precipitation. So we were using the compass and tape, old school methods, measuring the boundary the way Hoke Garrett would have done it in the 1940s. We found 7 more headstones, 7 in one day. Some were in places so remote, so far from any path or clearing, that I could not imagine how anyone had carried a 50-pound stone to the spot. One was wedged into a rock outcrop on a 40-degree slope, set upright in a crevice. as though the mountain itself had opened to receive it. One was at the bottom of a drainage so thick with rhododendron that Dale had to cut a path with the machete to reach it. One was underwater, submerged in the pool below a small waterfall, the name and date visible through 6 inches of perfectly clear water, the letters wavering as the current moved over them. The names. I wrote them all down. I wrote them in the field book I carried for survey notes, on the left-hand pages, which by convention are for sketches and observations rather than measurements. Name, date, location, condition. I wrote them with the focused tension of a man who has decided that if he is going to be part of something he does not understand, he is at least going to be a good witness. Some of the dates had passed, some had not. The range was extraordinary. The earliest date was 1947. The latest was 2043. 2 names appeared to be children, based on the dates. If they corresponded to births and deaths, the lifespans would have been 6 years and 11 years, respectively. I tried not to think about that. I failed. By Friday evening, we had found a total of 17 headstones, including mine and Dale's. 17 names, 17 dates, scattered across the eastern half of an 814-acre tract on a mountain in North Georgia. And we hadn't even started on the western half. Saturday was supposed to be a day off, but Dale called my motel room at 6 in the morning and asked if I was willing to work. He'd been up all night, he said. He'd been thinking about something. The deed descriptions, he said, the old ones. The calls reference natural features, trees, creeks, rocks, but some of them reference improvements. A stone wall near the branch, a flat stone set in the ground at the head of the hollow. I went through every deed in the chain last night. Some of those references aren't boundary monuments. They're describing the headstones. I sat up in bed. The room was cold. The motel's heating system was unreliable, and I'd slept under every blanket available. You're saying the headstones are referenced in the deeds? Not explicitly, not as headstones, but the surveyors who wrote the original descriptions, the ones from the 1800s, they were walking the same land. They saw stones. They referenced them. A dressed stone near the spring. A squared stone on the bench above the creek. They didn't know what they were looking at. They just used them as reference points. Dale, the deeds go back to the 1840s. I know. You said the headstones were 60 to 80 years old. A long pause. I said that based on the weathering. But the deed references suggest they were there in the 1840s, which means either I'm wrong about the age or he didn't finish the sentence. Or the stones had been there for 200 years, carved by hand with names and dates of people who wouldn't be born for another century and a half. Or they'd been replaced. New stones, set in the same positions, carrying the same function, updated by successive generations of a family that had held the land since removal. Or the weathering was deceptive, and sandstone in deep mountain shade aged differently than I or Dale or anyone had accounted for. None of these explanations were good. But they were explanations, and I needed them the way a drowning man needs anything that floats, regardless of whether it will reach shore. We drove up the mountain. The rain had stopped overnight, but the forest was still dripping. Every leaf and branch loaded with water that fell in heavy drops when the wind stirred the canopy. The creaks were high and loud. The air smelled like tannin and cold earth. Dale wanted to revisit the workshop on Elder's Branch. He had a theory. He wanted to examine the tools more carefully, look for maker's marks, anything that could date them independently. We hiked in from the creek crossing, following the watercourse upstream. The walk took 40 minutes. The forest floor was a carpet of wet leaves, and our boots made no sound on it, which gave the approach a quality of stealth that felt wrong, as though we were sneaking up on something that might not want to be found again. The workshop was as we'd left it, the wall, the shelf, the tools, but something was different, and it took me a moment to identify it. There were fresh stone chips on the shelf, small flakes of sandstone, pale against the dark, wet surface of the work shelf. Fresh enough that they hadn't been rained on. They were dry on the undersides, which meant they'd been produced after the rain stopped, after last night, after we'd last been here. Dale saw them at the same moment I did. He reached out and touched one of the chips, rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, looked at the dust it left on his skin. "Someone's been here," he said. We looked at each other. We looked at the tools. The chisel had been moved, not much, maybe 2 inches from where Dale had set it down on Wednesday, but enough that we both noticed. The mallet was in the same position. The letter punches were arranged differently. They had been in a rough line, and now they were grouped, as though someone had pulled out specific letters and set them aside. I looked at the grouped punches. I counted them. There were 7 set apart from the rest. I looked at the letters on their faces. They were inverted, as letter punches are, meant to stamp a mirror image that reads correctly in the stone. I mentally reversed them. 7 letters. They spelled a name, my daughter's name. The forest around us was very still. The creek was the only sound, the creek and the dripping of water from the canopy, and my own heartbeat, which I could feel in my throat and in my wrists and behind my eyes. "Dale," I said. He was already looking at the punches. He'd read the name too. He knew my daughter's name because I'd talked about her. He looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw fear on his face. Not for himself, but the specific fear of a man watching someone else receive a blow he cannot deflect. "We need to leave," I said. "Listen to me. We need to leave right now. We need to get off this mountain, and I need to go home. Listen to me." Dale put his hand on my arm. His grip was strong, decades of fieldwork, and it held me in place. "If you leave now, you won't come back. And if you don't come back, you won't know. I don't care about knowing. That's my daughter's name. I see it. I know what it is. And I'm telling you that the stones we've found with future dates, we don't know what happens to those people. Gareth died, but the woman from 87, I never confirmed what happened to her. For all I know, she's alive right now, 70 years old, living somewhere with no idea that a stone in the woods carries her name. And for all you know, she's dead. Yes, and for all I know, but the stones don't cause death. The stones record it, or predict, or something else entirely that we don't have a word for. And the only way to understand what they do, what they are, is to stay and look. I pulled my arm free. I walked downstream. I walked maybe 100 yards, out of sight of the workshop, and I stood on a gravel bar in the middle of Elder's Branch, with the cold water running over my boots, and I tried to think. My daughter's name, spelled out in iron punches on a stone shelf in the mountains, as though someone, something, was preparing to carve it, as though the process that had produced 17 headstones over the span of decades or centuries was still active, still working, still adding names, not just recording the future, creating new records now, while we were on the mountain. I thought about leaving. I thought about the $4,200 and the dental bill and the rent and the truck payment. I thought about Dale, who had been carrying Gareth Powell's death for 15 years and had come back here anyway, not out of bravery, but out of the same need I recognized in myself. The need to understand, because not understanding was its own kind of death, slower but just as final. And I thought about this. If my daughter's name was being carved into a stone, then the stone would exist whether I was here or not. Leaving wouldn't stop it. The stones had been here for decades, for centuries maybe, and they had not required an audience to be made. Whatever process was at work, my presence didn't fuel it, and my absence wouldn't halt it. But my presence might allow me to learn something that could protect her. Some rule, some logic, some way the system worked that could be understood and therefore navigated. If there was any chance of that, any chance at all, then leaving was the most dangerous thing I could do. Not for me, for her. I walked back upstream. Dale was sitting on a rock near the workshop, waiting. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me and waited. "I'm staying," I said, "but I need you to help me understand what this is, not guess, not speculate." He nodded. "And if we find a stone with her name on it," I said, "I need to know what to do." "If we find one," Dale said carefully, "we'll know more than we do now. And knowing more is the only tool we have." We went back to the workshop. The letter punches were still grouped, my daughter's name still spelled out in iron on wet stone. Dale photographed them. Then, deliberately, he scattered the punches back into a random arrangement, mixing them with the others. "If they regroup," he said, "we'll know something is actively working here. If they stay scattered, it was a coincidence. You don't believe that?" "No, but I believe in testing." We left the creek and climbed to the western boundary, which we hadn't touched yet. The western side of the property was different from the east, steeper, with more rock outcroppings and less soil, the kind of terrain where the mountain's bones show through. The trees were smaller here, stressed by thin soil and exposure, and the underbrush was sparser. You could see further. The light was different, more direct, less filtered. It felt more exposed, which after the claustrophobia of the eastern draws was both a relief and a vulnerability. We found the first headstone on the western side within 30 minutes. It was set into a rock ledge, tucked under an overhang, protected from weather. The carving on this one was remarkably sharp, the letters crisp-edged, the serifs clean, as though it had been carved recently. But the lichen growth was the same as the others, which suggested it was the same age. The protection of the overhang had simply preserved the detail. The name on the stone was Martha Pickett. Martha, the clerk at the courthouse, the woman who had smiled at Dale with a complicated smile and known we were working on the elder's place. The date was 4 years from now. Dale stared at it for a long time. Then he took his phone out and photographed it and didn't say anything, and we moved on. By noon we had found 5 more on the western side. The density was higher here. The stones were closer together, separated by hundreds of feet, rather than the quarter miles and half miles that separated them on the eastern slope, and the terrain features that contained them were more dramatic. Rock ledges, cliff bases, the mouths of small caves. Several of the stones were partially hidden, not by vegetation but by the rock itself, as though they had been deliberately placed in spots where casual observations would miss them. The names continued to be a mix of common and uncommon. The dates continued to span decades. One stone bore a date from 1952 and a name that Dale recognized. An old Gilmer County family, long gone. "That man died in 1952, Dale said quietly. "I remember my father talking about it. Heart attack. He was in his 50s. Another confirmation. Another stone that had told the truth. We ate lunch on a rock outcrop overlooking the western slope. Below us, the mountain fell away in a tumble of hardwoods, and exposed stone. And beyond that, the valley of the Kartikeya River stretched south toward Elijah, green and gold and ordinary. I could see the road we drove every morning. I could see rooftops. I could see the thread of the river catching light. The distance between where I sat and the ordinary world below was maybe 3 miles, but it felt like the distance between two kinds of reality. One where headstones in the were vandalism or folk art or the work of a disturbed person, and one where they were something else entirely, something that operated on principles I did not have access to. Dale, I said, how many do you think there are total? He chewed his sandwich and looked out at the valley. Based on density so far, extrapolating across 814 acres, accounting for terrain, he did the math in his head. 200, maybe more, maybe significantly more. 200 headstones, 200 names, all carved by hand, all placed individually, all with specific dates, all by Ruth elders, or someone in the family before her, or a succession of them. And the workshop is still active. Someone is still carving. Dale didn't answer that. He folded his sandwich wrapper carefully and put it in his pack. I want to go back to the workshop tomorrow, I said. I want to see if the punches moved. So do I. And I want to search the area around it more thoroughly. If that's where the stones were made, there might be unfinished ones. Works in progress. Blanks. Something that tells us more about the process. Dale nodded. Agreed. But I want to finish the western boundary today. We're behind on the survey, and if Hargrove starts asking questions about why we're taking so long, I'd rather have the data to show for it. We worked until dark. We found 3 more headstones, bringing the total to 28. 28 names, 28 dates, and the growing certainty, which neither of us said aloud, that we had barely scratched the surface of what was on this mountain. That night, back at the motel, I did something I'd been avoiding. I opened my laptop and searched for the names. Not all of them. I started with the ones that had dates that had already passed, on the theory that if the stones predicted death, there should be records, obituaries, death certificates, something. The internet in rural North Georgia in October was slow and unreliable, but I found enough. The first name I searched, the one Dale had recognized, the heart attack in 1952, turned up in a digitized newspaper archive from the Gilmer County newspaper, Obituary. Died March 15th, 1952. The date on the stone was March 15, 1952. The second name, with a date of 1978, turned up in a Social Security Death Index search. Date of death matched. The third, the fourth, the fifth. Every name I could find, with every date I could verify, matched. 7 out of 7. Perfect correspondence. The stones had told the truth. Every time. Without exception. I closed the laptop. The room was very quiet. The ice machine outside my door had stopped cycling. The trucks on the highway had thinned out. It was past midnight, and even the long haulers had pulled over. The world outside my window was dark and still, and I was sitting in a motel room in Elijah, Georgia, with a spreadsheet of confirmed deaths and a stone on a mountain that said I had 13 days left. 13 days. I opened the laptop again and searched for my daughter's name. Not in death records, in everything. Social media, school directories, news. I wanted to see her name in contexts that were alive, that were current, that were the opposite of carved in stone. I found her school's website, which listed her in the 3rd grade class roster. I found a photo from a soccer game my ex-wife had posted. My daughter in a green jersey, mid-stride, her face serious with concentration. She was alive. She was real. She was playing soccer and studying Neptune and eating spaghetti she didn't like. And somewhere on a mountain 3 hours north of her, iron letter punches were being arranged to spell her name by hands. I could not see. Sunday, Dale. And I drove up in silence. The weather had cleared again. Another blue day, the color peaking now, the ridges on fire with orange and red. We went directly to the workshop. The letter punches had moved. They were not grouped to spell my daughter's name. They were arranged differently now, a different name, a name I didn't recognize. 8 letters, a woman's name. I wrote it down. But here is what stopped me. Here is what made the forest tilt slightly on its axis, made the creek sound different, made the light change quality in a way I couldn't pinpoint, but could feel. There was a new stone on the shelf, not a finished headstone, a blank, a rough rectangle of sandstone, about 2 feet by 18 inches, uncarved, the surface dressed flat on one side and rough on the other. It had not been there on Friday. It had not been there when we'd last stood at this shelf, and it had not walked here by itself. Someone, something, had quarried this stone, rough-shaped it, carried it to the workshop, and placed it on the shelf in the 2 days since our last visit. Dale touched the dressed face of the blank. His fingers came away with fine stone dust on them, fresh dust, the kind that hasn't been rained on or settled. Active, he said. This is active, right now, while we're standing here. I looked around the forest, the creek, the trees, the rhododendron on the opposite bank, the canopy overhead. Everything was still. Everything was silent except the water. There was no one. There was nothing. Just the 2 of us and the tools and the blank stone and the iron punches arranged in a name that would, if the pattern held, eventually be carved into that stone and carried to a spot on this mountain where no one would find it until someone like us came looking. Who's doing this, Dale? He shook his head, slowly, not a denial, but an acknowledgement that the question had passed beyond anything his experience could answer. Ruth Elders has been dead since 1963, he said. Clement Elders died in 1988. Pauline died in June. There are no elders left. No one lives on this land. No one has lived on it for 3 years. Then who's carrying stone to this shelf? Who's arranging the punches? He didn't answer. He picked up the chisel and held it to the light, the grey, filtered light that came down through the canopy and made everything look like it was being observed through old glass. The chisel's edge was bright, recently sharpened, recently used. He set it down. He looked at me with an expression that had moved past fear into something I can only describe as solemnity. The face of a man who has arrived at the edge of what he can process and is choosing to stand there rather than step back. I think we need to find Ruth Elder's grave, he said. Not a headstone in the woods, her actual grave, where her body is. Why? Because everything on this mountain traces back to her. The stones, the workshop, the knowledge, all of it. If there's anything to find that explains this, it's where she is. The family cemetery. There must be one. Every family on a property like this would have had a burial ground. We haven't found one. We've found individual headstones, scattered, isolated, each one alone. But no cemetery, no group burials, no fence plot. Don't you think that's strange? He was right. It was strange. In 4 days of walking this mountain, covering most of its 814 acres, we had not found a single traditional cemetery, no family plot, no grouping of graves. Just the individual stones, alone in the forest, each bearing a single name and a single date. The Elders family had been on this land for 180 years. People had been born here, had lived here, had died here. Where were they buried? We need to look at the centers, I said. The deed calls describe the boundary. We've been working the perimeter, but the middle of the property, the interior, we haven't walked any of it. Dale nodded. The high flat, there's a bench near the summit. I saw it on the topo map. Relatively level ground, about 3 acres, surrounded by steep slopes on all sides. If I were going to put a family cemetery on this mountain, that's where I'd put it. We packed up and climbed. The route from Elder's Branch to the summit bench was 1,000 vertical feet of hard going. Steep, rocky, the rhododendron thickening as we climbed into the zone where the moisture concentrated. Dale led, machete in hand, cutting when he had to, threading through gaps when he could. We didn't talk. The exertion was too much for conversation, and besides, neither of us had anything to say that would have been adequate to what we were walking toward. We reached the bench at noon. Dale's topo map had described it accurately. A relatively flat area near the summit, maybe 3 acres, with a dense canopy of old hardwoods and a carpet of undisturbed leaf litter. The trees here were enormous, tulip poplars with trunks 4 feet in diameter, white oaks that had to be 300 years old, their branches spreading wide and interlocking above, creating a ceiling so dense that the sky was invisible. The light on the bench was cathedral light, dim, golden where a shaft broke through, cool and green everywhere else. There were no headstones on the bench, none. We walked it end to end, systematically, 50-foot intervals, scanning the ground. No stones, no markers, no graves, no evidence of burial at all. What there was in the exact center of the bench was a hole, not a grave, not a pit dug by an animal. A hole in the ground about 3 feet in diameter, with walls of exposed rock, the bedrock of the mountain, sandstone, the same stone the headstones were made of. The hole was dark. I crouched at its edge and looked down and could not see the bottom. Dale dropped a pebble in. We listened. We didn't hear it land. We looked at each other. Dale got down on his hands and knees and leaned over the edge. He took out his headlamp and shone it down. The beam hit the rock walls, smooth, almost polished, as though water had been flowing over them for millennia, and then disappeared into darkness. The hole went down further than the light could reach. Natural feature, Dale said, but his voice was uncertain. Sinkhole, karst geology. The sandstone dissolves over time and sandstone doesn't form karst, that's limestone. He looked at me. He knew I was right. Karst topography requires soluble rock, limestone, dolomite, gypite. Sandstone doesn't dissolve. Sandstone erodes, weathers, breaks down grain by grain. It doesn't form sinkholes. It doesn't form vertical shafts with polished walls descending into invisible depths. This hole should not exist. We sat at the edge of it for a long time. The air coming up from the hole was cool, noticeably cooler than the ambient temperature, and it had a smell, not unpleasant, mineral, clean. Like the air inside a cave, which is what it probably was, a cave, an opening in the rock, leading down into the mountain itself. But the smoothness of the walls, the perfect circularity, the depth, none of it fit a natural formation, and both of us knew it, and neither of us said so, because saying so would mean accepting that someone, the same, someone who had carved the headstones, had also carved this, a shaft, into the mountain, by hand. Dale picked up a larger rock, about the size of a fist, and dropped it in. We counted. 1 second, 2, 3, 4, 5. At 6 seconds we heard it hit. Not a splash. A sound more like a chime. A clear, resonant note, as though the rock had struck something metallic, or something that vibrated. The sound rose out of the hole and dissipated into the canopy above, and for a moment the forest was absolutely silent. No birds, no wind, no dripping water, as though everything on the mountain had paused to listen. Then, The silence broke, and the ordinary sounds returned, and Dale stood up and took 3 steps back from the edge. "We need rope," he said. "We are not going down there. Not today, but we need to know what's at the bottom." "Dale, we are surveyors. We are here to measure a boundary and produce a plat. We are not here to rappel into unexplained holes in the ground on a mountain full of headstones that predict people's deaths." He looked at me, and despite everything, despite the fear and the strangeness and the 13 days ticking down in the back of my mind, he almost smiled. "You're right," he said. "We're surveyors. So let's survey it." He set up the total station on the edge of the bench, oriented it, and shot a vertical angle down into the hole. The electronic distance measurement returned an error. The beam needed a reflective surface to bounce off, and whatever was at the bottom didn't provide one. But the vertical angle, combined with our elapsed time for the dropped rock, gave us a rough depth estimate. The hole was approximately 180 feet deep, 180 feet straight down through solid sandstone on the summit bench of a mountain in North Georgia. Not a mine. There was no mining history in this part of the county, and no mineral worth mining in sandstone. Not a well. You don't drill wells on mountaintops, and wells don't have polished walls. Not a sinkhole, because the geology didn't support it. A shaft, purpose unknown, made by hands that also made the headstones, on land held by one family since the Cherokee removal, at the center of a property ringed by stones that bore the names of the dead and the not yet dead. We marked it on the plat. We measured its diameter. We documented it with the same professional thoroughness we'd applied to everything else, because that was what we knew how to do. And then we packed up and started down the mountain, and neither of us spoke until we reached the truck. At the gas station that evening, Dale sat in his truck for a long time. I stood outside, leaning against my truck's tailgate, watching the sun set behind the western ridge. The sky was pink and gold, and the mountains were black silhouettes, and the gas station's fluorescent canopy was buzzing, and a moth was circling the light, and the world looked exactly like it always had, which was the most disorienting thing of all. 12 days, Dale said through his open window. "I know. I'm going to get rope tomorrow, and a harness, and a headlamp rated for vertical work. You're going down." "I am. Alone, unless you're coming with me." I looked at the sky. I looked at the mountains. I looked at the moth, still circling. "My daughter's name is on that shelf," I said, in iron letters, being arranged by something I can't see. I know. If there's anything down that hole that explains this, anything that tells me how to protect her, I need to see it. "Then you're coming." "I'm coming," Dale nodded. Once, he started his truck. "Monday," he said. "We go down Monday." He drove away. I stood in the parking lot. The fluorescent light buzzed. The moth circled. The mountains were black against a sky that was fading from pink to grey to the deep blue-black that comes before full dark. Somewhere up there, on a bench near the summit, a hole in the ground descended 180 feet into the body of the mountain, and at the bottom of it, something had produced a sound like a chime when struck, and above it, in the ancient forest, 28 headstones stood in the rain and the fog and the silence, bearing names and dates with perfect accuracy. And on a shelf beside a creek, iron punches were being arranged by hands that did not exist to spell the names of people who were still alive. 12 days. I had 12 days. My name was on a stone, and my daughter's name was being prepared, and I was going to descend into a hole in a mountain to find out why, and the only person I trusted to go with me was a man whose name was on a stone with the same date as mine, which meant that whatever was coming for me was coming for him too, and we were walking toward it together because neither of us knew how to walk away. I went to my motel room. I sat on the bed. I called my daughter. It went to voicemail. She was at her mother's, probably asleep. It was past 9 on a Sunday night, and she had school in the morning. I listened to her recorded greeting, which she'd made herself, her voice bright and confident and slightly too loud because she'd held the phone too close to her mouth. "Hi, this is me. Leave a message and I'll call you back, unless you're a robot. If you're a robot, please hang up." I didn't leave a message. I sat holding the phone and listening to the silence that followed. The mechanical silence of a connection that was open but empty, and I thought about the hole on the mountain and the silence at its bottom, and how both silences felt the same. Not absent but full of something waiting to be heard by someone willing to descend far enough to hear it. Monday was 2 days away. The rope was coming, the hole was waiting, and the stones on the mountain held their silence, each one standing in its own private clearing, its own private darkness, patient as only stone can be, bearing names that had not yet learned they'd been written,